"Excuse me, are you the help? The servers should use the side entrance." The question hit me like a splash of cold water, though it was delivered with the polished condescension of someone born to effortless wealth. Diane Ashworth, wife of my chief executive officer, Gregory Ashworth, looked me up and down. Her gaze wasn't hostile, it was worse. It was entirely dismissive. The way one might regard an unpleasant smudge on designer leather. I stood in the marble foyer of the Ritz-Carlton, where the annual Ashford Technologies Gala was in full swing. This was the event I had established 12 years prior, when Ashford was a 3-person operation run out of my cramped studio apartment. Now, it was a tech leader worth $340 million, and I, the majority owner, was being directed to the service entrance. I felt the heat rise instantly on the cheeks of my 14-year-old daughter, Zoe. I had brought her tonight to show her what a professional celebration looked like. The kind of success that comes from years of difficult, honest work. Instead, she was watching one of the most visible faces of my company humiliate me. I was wearing a simple, elegant black cocktail dress. My hair was pulled back. I had chosen not to wear any ostentatious jewelry, opting only for the small pearl earrings my mother had given me. My mother, who had spent 30 years working as a housekeeper, who had put me through college on the tips and minimum wage she earned. I looked, I suppose, like someone who worked for a living, which, unlike the woman standing before me, was absolutely true. 3 executives nearby, people who reported directly to Gregory, heard the exchange and chuckled into their champagne flutes, their shoulders shaking slightly. The sound was a sharp, grating noise against the background hum of expensive conversation and light classical music. I remained perfectly still, feeling Zoe shift slightly behind me, her small hand gripping the silk of my dress. I was not ready to reveal my identity. I needed to see how Diane Ashworth would treat a stranger she assumed was beneath her. That was the real test of the culture Gregory had fostered. "I'm not with the catering company," I replied, my voice calm, resisting the urge to let the cold fury I felt leak out. Diane's perfectly microbladed eyebrow arched higher. "Then who are you? This is an executive event, invitation only." "I'm aware," I said. "I designed the invitation list." Confusion flickered across her flawless face, followed by annoyance. Before she could formulate her next sharp retort, Gregory himself appeared at her side. He was laughing loudly at some stale joke he was telling, already flushed from the expensive wine. "Diane, darling, I see you've met." He trailed off as his eyes landed on me. The laughter died in his throat, and the color drained from his face with terrifying speed. "Ms. Monroe. I didn't realize you were attending this year." The executives who had been snickering abruptly ceased their laughter, now intensely studying the bubbles in their drinks. The silence that followed was thick, expensive, and heavy with dread. "I almost didn't," I said, maintaining my tone of cool control. "But I wanted to show my daughter what our annual celebration looks like." I gestured to Zoe, whose eyes, wide with protective anger, met Gregory's briefly before snapping back to his wife. Diane's expression fractured, the condescension replaced by dawning uncertainty. "Your daughter," she repeated, her voice a little higher than before. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Diane Ashworth. I know who you are, I stated simply. The awkwardness stretched out, a painful, tangible thing. I felt the need to end the humiliation swiftly, not for myself, but for Zoe. I was just telling your wife that I'm not with the catering company, I continued, a slight, slow smile touching my lips. Though I can see how the confusion arose. Simple black dress, no diamonds. I must look terribly out of place among all this success. I gestured vaguely at the glittering, overdressed crowd. Gregory laughed nervously, a wet, panicked sound. Ms. Monroe has an unusual sense of humor. She's actually leaving. He tried to physically steer his wife away. A frantic, desperate movement. We are. I interrupted, stepping forward and putting my arm around Zoe's rigid shoulders. Zoe has school tomorrow, and I think we've seen enough. I walked toward the main exit, not waiting for a response. Pulling my daughter gently with me. As we passed through the foyer and into the chilly night air, I heard Gregory's sharp, panicked whisper cutting through the doors before they swung shut. Do you have any idea who that was? I didn't hear Diane's reply. But I didn't need to. I already knew everything I needed to know about Gregory's leadership and the rotten core of the culture I had let him create. I had been planning to address the company's internal issues for months, but last night had accelerated my timeline by an entire year. My avoidance, my fear of being the visible leader, had a cost I was no longer willing to pay. By 6 even in the morning, be 6 in the morning the next day. The space was a modest, converted spare bedroom with a view of my small, quiet backyard. Nothing about it suggested the wealth it had generated. At 7 in the morning, I sent an email to Gregory and the entire executive team. The subject line was chillingly simple. Emergency board meeting, 10 in the morning. Full attendance required. Topic: company culture and leadership evaluation. Eleanor Monroe, founding partner. The lingering sting of the night before, still visible in Zoe's slightly guarded look as she prepared for school, motivated me to stop planning and finally start acting. I sat in my home office, a space that was the antithesis of the opulence of the Ritz-Carlton. It was a converted spare bedroom with pale blue walls and a second-hand desk I'd bought 12 years ago. The window offered a view of my small, unassuming backyard, framed by a struggling maple tree. Nothing about this modest, quiet place hinted at the $340 million empire it had generated. I opened a file on my old laptop labeled, simply, Project Firebreak. Inside were the detailed, aggregated human resources reports, meticulously compiled by Sandra Wells, our head of HR. Sandra was a quiet warrior who had been fighting the tide of toxicity alone for years. The data was damning. Over the last 3 years, female employee turnover had spiked by 47%. The exit interviews cited the same phrases over and over: dismissive leadership, hostile environment, and lack of opportunity. I scrolled through several anonymized complaint files, noting that every single one had been dismissed by the executive level, by Gregory's people, as a misunderstanding or a personality conflict. I realized then that my internal conflict, my fear of power, and my need to retreat into the safe, technical world of founding partner, had actively caused this. I was better at building systems than managing people. And when I chose Gregory 5 years ago, I thought I was hiring the polish and the presence I lacked. He had the Wharton MBA, the ease with investors, the charm at Galas. He was supposed to be the perfect face for Ashford. But I had given him too much rope, too much authority, because I was scared of the spotlight. I let him define the culture by his arrogance. And because I stood silently in the background, this malignancy had been allowed to fester. It wasn't just Gregory's failure. It was my avoidance that was the true harm. The price of my silence was the livelihoods and dignity of 700 employees. I took a deep breath, the cold resolve hardening in my chest. I drafted the email again, ensuring the language was concise, professional, and utterly unyielding. I needed to move beyond the personal insult and focus on the corporate cancer. At precisely 7 o'clock, I clicked send. The phone rang 2 minutes later. It was Gregory. His voice, usually smooth and confident, was tight with panic. April, Eleanor. About last night. Ms. Monroe, you know Diane didn't know who you were. It was an honest mistake. She feels terrible. He spoke too fast, trying to contain the damage before it could start. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow sip. We'll discuss everything at 10 in the morning, Gregory. But this is drastic. An emergency board meeting. You haven't called one of those in 3 years. Look, I've spoken with Diane. She's prepared to call you, to send flowers, whatever you need. Was it an honest mistake, Gregory? I asked, keeping my voice even. She looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong. That tells me something crucial about the culture you've created here at Ashford. She's not an employee, Eleanor. She's my wife. Her opinions aren't the company's responsibility. His voice was starting to grate with defensive anger. Her opinions reflect what she hears at home, Gregory. What she sees modeled. What she believes is acceptable behavior for your leadership circle. That environment spills over. The fact that the entire executive team, standing nearby, snickered, tells me everything I need to know about the lack of respect for women and for work itself. He started to sputter. You are basing a company evaluation on a social misunderstanding. I am basing it on 3 years of measurable data, which you have systematically ignored, Gregory. Last night was merely the visible symptom of the disease. I paused, the silence stretching. I'll see you at 10 in the morning. I hung up the phone before he could respond. The conversation had done its job. Gregory was isolated, and he knew the conversation would be about more than just his wife's blunder. It would be about his job and the fundamental rot beneath the polish. I had defined the boundary, and for the first time in years, I felt the satisfying weight of my own authority settle back onto my shoulders. The Wes avoidance was over. The fight for integrity had begun. After the cutting phone call with Gregory, I walked into the kitchen, the weight of the coming confrontation palpable. I needed coffee, but more. I needed a moment with Zoe. She was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone, but her posture was tense. Are you okay, Mom? She asked without looking up, her voice small. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a busy morning. She pushed off the counter and looked directly at me. That lady was really mean. She looked at us like we were garbage. I poured the coffee, letting the silence settle before answering. Some people judge others by how they look instead of who they are. It says far more about them than it does about us. But you own the company, she pressed, the confusion still evident in her eyes. This was the crux of her young struggle. Why hadn't the powerful person she knew me to be used that power to defend herself? You could have told her. You could have shut her down. I stirred cream into my mug, choosing my words carefully. I could have. But I didn't. I wanted to see how she treated someone she thought was less than her. That is the real test of character, Zoe. If a person treats a server, a housekeeper, or the help with disrespect, that tells you who they truly are when they think no one important is watching. She frowned, turning the concept over in her mind. Did she fail the test? Spectacularly, I confirmed. A small smile finally broke through her guarded expression. Are you going to fire her husband? The directness of the question was startling, yet exactly what I needed to hear. It crystallized my internal debate. I wasn't just fighting for corporate reform. I was fighting to show my daughter that justice and integrity could win. That, I said, looking down at her, depends entirely on the conversation we have today. The minutes dragged until 9:40, 5 in the morning. I drove downtown to the Ashford Technologies headquarters. The executive conference room, located on the 25th floor, was usually reserved for celebratory quarterly reviews. Today, the mood was funereal. The mahogany table could seat 20. But only 8 chairs were filled. Myself, Gregory, 5 other board members who were primarily passive investors, and Sandra Wells, our head of HR. Gregory was already seated at the head of the table, a position he had claimed years ago without my input, acting like the unquestioned king. His suit looked expensive and flawless, but his jaw was rigid, and his eyes darted nervously. I walked the length of the room and chose a seat at the dais opposite end of the table. It was a subtle, but deliberate, act of opposition. I was not there to share space. I was there to challenge his command. The other board members, Harold the longest serving among them, looked away, clearly hoping to remain neutral. They had been content for years, to collect their fees and approve reports. Actual oversight and messy human conflict were not part of their routines. I set my folder down with a quiet thud. I looked across the expanse of the highly polished table at Gregory, and knew that the only thing that mattered now was holding firm to the moral clarity Zoe had helped me find. I was no longer afraid of the confrontation. The bass mounting tension before the showdown was now a fuel I could use. I had a daughter watching, and a company to save. The board members filed in, their rustling movements and hushed greetings, amplifying the unusual nature of this emergency meeting. We sat, facing each other, across the 20 feet of polished mahogany. I started immediately, leaving no room for Gregory to seize control of the agenda. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I began, my voice clear and controlled, echoing slightly in the vast room. We need to discuss Ashford Technologies' direction, specifically regarding workplace culture and leadership evaluation. Is this about last night, Eleanor? Gregory interrupted, leaning forward. He was attempting to exert his usual control, dismissing the corporate issue as a personal spat. Because I've already spoken with Diane. She feels terrible about the misunderstanding. It's about more than last night, Gregory. Last night was merely the visible symptom. Sandra, would you please share the retention data you provided to me last month? Sandra Wells, head of human resources, sat next to me. She opened her laptop with a professional click, her expression stoic, like a seasoned surgeon finally allowed into the operating room. Over the past 3 years, Sandra began, her voice measured and steady. Female employee turnover has increased by 47%. This is double the rate for male employees. Exit interviews consistently cite a hostile environment, lack of advancement opportunity, and dismissive behavior from senior leadership as primary factors. Gregory scoffed. Those are subjective complaints, Sandra. People leave for all sorts of reasons. We're in a tight labor market. 63% of departing female employees specifically mentioned interactions with senior leadership as contributing to their decision. Sandra countered, not flinching. Furthermore, we've had 14 formal complaints regarding inappropriate comments and behavior filed in the past 18 months. 3 of those specifically mention executives. None of those complaints resulted in meaningful action. Gregory's face was tightening, his veneer of smooth confidence cracking under the barrage of facts. We followed procedure, Eleanor. Every complaint was investigated. Every single one was dismissed as misunderstanding or personality conflict after proper review. I slid my own folder across the table, closer to the other board members. I've reviewed the investigation files, Gregory. And Sandra's right. The pattern is clear. The procedure you followed seems designed not to find fault, but to simply make problems disappear. Harold, the longest-serving board member, fidgeted, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The other directors shifted uncomfortably. They understood numbers. They understood legal exposure. They were not accustomed to confronting the human cost of the company's success. I've been building this company for 12 years. I continued, my voice gaining volume but remaining even. I retreated to the background because I thought operational expertise and market strategy mattered more than my presence. I see now that absence has a significant cost. When leadership doesn't see consequences for dismissive, toxic behavior, that behavior becomes normalized. It becomes the culture. What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor? Harold asked, his voice strained. I presented my framework. First, a comprehensive, independent culture audit conducted by an external firm. Second, mandatory, intensive training for all executives on inclusive leadership and accountability. Third, a restructuring of our complaint process to ensure independent investigation and reporting directly to a non-executive board member. Gregory erupted, slamming his hand lightly on the table, the noise sharp and shocking. That could take months. It would cost a fortune. It's entirely unnecessary overreach. Wood generated $47 million in profit last year, Gregory. I stated, cutting through his outrage. We can absolutely afford to invest in the people who generated that profit. This is not overreach. This is necessary course correction. He leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping to a dangerous sneer. You are a silent partner, Eleanor. The board handles governance, not the internal procedures of my staff. This is a personal vendetta masked as data. I let his insult hang in the air. My frustration, mounting at his persistent refusal to acknowledge the fundamental problem. He was fighting the solution, because he was the source of the disease. I had to abandon the analytical approach now. It was time to pull the core power move. The facts were exhausted, only the personal, unassailable truth remained. The conflict over data was shifting, irrevocably, into a direct power struggle, and I was about to use the sharpest weapon I had: the humiliation he had inflicted on my daughter. Seeing the board members hesitate, swayed by Gregory's forceful refusal and the immense cost of the proposed audit, I realized that data alone wouldn't win this fight. I needed to shift the conversation from cold spreadsheets to undeniable moral failure. I needed to use the thing Gregory most wanted to ignore: the personal dimension. I pushed back in my chair, adjusting the angle of my laptop so the screen reflected the light. I let the silence stretch for 5 full breaths. "You said, this is a personal vendetta," I said, my voice low now, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear me. "Let's discuss the personal for a moment. Last night, your wife, Diane, looked at me, the person who conceived, funded, and built everything you have benefited from, and assumed I was the help. She dismissed me to a side entrance." Gregory's face was already red, but he tried to dismiss it one last time. "We've been over this." "That's not fair. Diane isn't. Diane is a reflection of what she has learned is acceptable within your sphere, Gregory. She has watched you dismiss women's contributions for 5 years. She has heard you joke about diversity hires and politically correct nonsense in the comfortable privacy of your home. She has absorbed the message that some people belong and others don't, and she applies that judgment based on appearance and lack of ostentation." I focused my gaze directly on him. "She judged me based on the standards you set. When I told her I wasn't catering staff, she didn't apologize. She demanded to know who I was, because she couldn't imagine that someone who looked like me, quiet, simple, professional, could possibly belong at an executive event. That casual prejudice is the direct result of the toxic environment you champion." His face mottled with fury. "You are seriously basing company policy on one comment from my wife at a party. You're ruining my reputation and threatening the company's stability over a slight." This was the opening I needed. I leaned forward, my voice losing its calm professionalism and taking on the edge of the emotional devastation I felt when I looked at Zoe that night. I was as vulnerably, and I was about to weaponize that vulnerability. "I'm basing company policy on 3 years of data, on 14 formal complaints, on a 47% increase in female turnover, and on the look on my 14-year-old daughter's face when she watched your wife humiliate me." I paused, letting the weight of the moment crush the carefully constructed defenses of everyone in the room. The executives looked down, avoiding my eyes. They had families, they understood that sting. I could see the shift in Harold's posture. The personal cost finally registered. "My daughter, Zoe, asked me this morning if I was going to fire you, Gregory," I continued. "I told her that it depends on this conversation. On whether you have the integrity, the self-awareness, and the humility to accept accountability for the environment you have created. Not just the one your wife displayed, but the one we see in Sandra's numbers." I looked him straight in the eye, my voice firming into a declarative command. So, let me ask you directly, Gregory. Are you willing to participate in meaningful culture change? Are you willing to be held accountable for the harm your leadership style has caused? The silence was immense. Every person in the room understood this was the ultimate moment of truth. He was being given a chance at redemption, a chance to acknowledge his failings before his entire board. He sat motionless, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I had forced him to face the moral and personal consequences of his actions. I had used my vulnerability to exert maximum force. I had won the emotional battle, and now, the corporate climax was imminent. I just had to wait for his answer. The room was utterly silent after my statement. Gregory's face, usually so smooth and polished, was red and wet with fury and shame. He stared at me from the head of the table. His eyes narrowed, calculating the cost of defiance versus compliance. The minutes that followed were the longest of the meeting. The tension thick and unbreathable, heavier than the silence before a final verdict. He was thinking of the public humiliation that would follow his abrupt departure. The tech blogs, the investor calls, the social circuit gossip. He had built his entire identity around the image of the successful, charismatic CEO of a $340 million company, and I had just threatened to take that identity away in an instant. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his expensive tie. His voice was a low, strained growl. And if I say no, Eleanor, I did not flinch. I let my authority fill the space I had avoided for years. Then we discuss your severance package. The board, I trust, understands the severity of the HR data and the corresponding legal liability we face if we fail to act decisively. And they know that without the founder's stability and investment, Ashford's stock will hemorrhage value. I brought my hand down flat on the table, not loudly, but with absolute finality. I am the majority owner. I founded this company, and I've been silent long enough. Gregory, you are here at my invitation, running the company I built. Your choice is accountability or unemployment. His chest rose and fell rapidly, the shallow breathing of a man who realized his world had just fractured. He realized he had no leverage, no escape. His MBA, his charm, his smooth talk, none of it mattered against the 62% stake I held. The power he thought he possessed, the power he had abused, was only ever on loan from me. The chair squeaked slightly under his weight. He smelled faintly of expensive cognac and fear. What would this accountability look like? He asked, the surrender already audible in his tone. The fight had left him. I immediately launched into the details, ensuring the terms were non-negotiable. The external culture audit starts tomorrow. The firm reports directly to the board, not to the CEO's office. You will enter mandatory executive coaching, focusing on inclusive leadership. You will be held to specific quarterly cultural metrics, tracked by Sandra, and reported to the board's audit committee. He tried to salvage some dignity. You're making me a probationary employee. You are the CEO on a probationary basis, yes. You will comply fully and transparently, or we reconvene in 90 days to execute the severance. The board members, relieved that the decision had been made for them, quickly voiced their support. Harold cleared his throat. It's in the best interest of the shareholders to maintain stability, while addressing these serious systemic failures. I move that we approve the restructuring framework outlined by Ms. Monroe. The vote was unanimous. The meeting continued for 3 more hours, as we hammered out the initial framework of the culture reform plan. Gregory participated grudgingly. But he participated. He was humbled and stripped of his absolute authority. Now, forced to work to fix the very culture he had poisoned just to maintain his position and his salary. As the meeting ended, and the board members filtered out, relieved that the crisis was averted, Sandra caught my arm just as I was gathering my files. "Thank you, April," she whispered, her eyes shining with relief. "I've been documenting these problems for 2 years." No one would listen. The weight of her fatigue settled on me. I should have listened sooner. I had the power to protect her, to protect everyone, and I had shied away. I should have listened sooner, Sandra, I admitted quietly. My absence was a form of neglect. But I'm here now. You listen now. That matters. I felt the tension release, a long, slow exhalation. I had moved from confronting my fear of visibility to commanding respect. And the victory felt earned, not inherited. I had successfully wielded my authority and my vulnerability to ensure the integrity of the company. I had spent 12 years building. The core conflict was resolved, but I knew the hardest part, the sustained effort of change, was only just beginning. Exiting the headquarters after the board meeting, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. The tension of the last 24 hours was finally releasing, leaving me drained but resolute. I had faced my fear of confrontation and had secured the necessary corporate victory. Now, I needed to reconnect with the moral center that had driven me. I drove straight home and told Zoe we were skipping dinner at home. "Pizza is on me tonight," I said. "Your choice." We need to celebrate a difficult week being over. Zoe chose her favorite local pizza place, a small, loud spot with checkered floors. As we waited for our table, the noise and chaos of a normal weeknight were a welcome antidote to the sterile quiet of the executive conference room. Over a messy slice of pepperoni, Zoe looked at me, her eyes still holding that perceptive intensity. "Did you fire him?" she asked again, cutting right to the chase. "Not yet, sweetheart. He's going to try to do better. He is going to face consequences for the harm he's caused. And he'll be working under very strict rules now. He has to change the culture." "Do you think he actually will?" I considered the question carefully. "I think people can change, Zoe, when there are consequences for not changing. When the alternative, losing everything, is worse than the effort required to fix yourself. He has a lot of work ahead of him. We will see if he is capable of true change." She chewed slowly, processing this adult lesson in motivation. "That lady called you the help. Like being someone who serves food is bad. But you were trying to show me how hard people work." I reached across the table and took her hand. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with honest work, Zoe. Your grandmother, my mother, was a housekeeper for 30 years. She raised me by herself, put me through college on what she earned cleaning other people's homes. And she taught me everything I know about integrity, about respect for an honest day's labor." This was the core of it. The reason the insult had hurt so deeply, triggering my resolve. I had to explain that distinction to her. So why did it hurt so much, Mom? She asked quietly. You didn't even look upset when Gregory did. But that lady, that felt like she was attacking you. It hurt, because she wasn't insulting the job. I clarified, my voice softening. She wasn't insulting the honest work of a server or a housekeeper, which deserves respect. She was insulting me. She was deciding I was worth less than her simply based on how I looked, how I dressed, and what she assumed my social status was. That kind of judgment, that prejudice that looks down on people, that's what hurts. It's the arrogance of believing that wealth and appearance grant you the right to dismiss someone else's entire value. Zoe's hand squeezed mine. You're worth more than all of them combined. I smiled. I don't know about that. But I have worked hard to build something meaningful, and I am not going to let anyone, even people in fancy dresses with mean faces, make me feel small for it. And I certainly won't let them make you feel small for it. She finally looked truly relaxed. The burden of the Gala incident lifted. I'm glad you got to talk to them today. You should be the CEO. I'm better at fixing the systems and setting the course, sweetheart. Gregory is better at the day-to-day chaos, provided he is being held accountable. We all have a role to play. I'm just taking back my job as the conscience and the ultimate authority. We finished our pizza, the conversation easing into happier teenage topics. But the thematic lesson was sealed. The insult had been a devastating personal injury. But by confronting the shame and using my power, I had transformed it into a moral directive. I had fully integrated my past, my mother's integrity, and my own humble beginnings with my present authority. The emotional conflict was resolved. My course was set. 6 months later, we stood in the exact same marble foyer of the Ritz-Carlton. The external culture audit was complete, providing a clear, detailed roadmap for improvement. The numbers Sandra had been tracking were finally turning, showing a slight but definite decrease in voluntary female turnover. Gregory was grudgingly implementing the changes, attending his mandated executive coaching sessions, and learning that genuine leadership was more complicated than charming investors. The threat of severance had proven to be a highly effective motivator. For the annual gala, I wore the same simple black dress. I had debated changing it, but the simple fact was, I liked it. It represented my integrity. This time, Zoe wore a matching one. Her idea, a sleek, youthful version of my understated elegance. We looked like a silent, formidable pair. The atmosphere at the gala felt subtly, almost indefinably, different. The laughter seemed less aggressive. The conversations slightly more cautious. Sandra Wells, who had been promoted and empowered with a larger budget and a direct line to the board's audit committee, smiled genuinely when she saw us. Then, Diane Ashworth spotted us across the room. She hesitated, then began the long, slow walk toward us, weaving her way through the glittering crowd. She was even more impeccably dressed than the year before, but her face held a distinct look of discomfort. She stopped 3 feet away, adjusting the clasp of her necklace. "Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice quiet. "I owe you an apology." I gave her a slow, neutral look. "You do?" "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you 6 months ago. It was inexcusable. Truly. It was." I agreed, accepting the admission without minimizing the harm. I accept your apology, Diane. She looked relieved, then uncertain about what to say next. She was a woman utterly fluent in the language of status. But her usual social armor had failed her, leaving her lost in the simple, raw communication of genuine remorse. This is my daughter, Zoe, I offered, placing a hand on Zoe's shoulder. She's the reason I was willing to push for this culture change. I want her to grow up in a world where women and men are not dismissed based on their appearance or perceived social standing. Diane looked at Zoe, and for the first time, I saw something approaching genuine warmth in her eyes, not just status recognition. That's a worthy goal, Monroe. We think so, I replied. She excused herself and walked quickly back toward her husband. Zoe watched her go, tilting her head. That was awkward, Zoe whispered. Growth usually is, sweetheart. It doesn't feel comfortable. Do you think she means it? I think she means it right now. Whether it lasts depends on whether she does the work to change her perspective, to rewire her assumptions. Like her husband, like everyone, I confirmed. Including me. I had to change too. I had to learn that silence is not strength. Zoe squeezed my hand. You're doing fine, Mom. I looked around the gala. At the people who worked here, at the company I'd built. It felt cleaner, sharper, and more honest than it had a year ago. The future we were creating together seemed brighter. I squeezed her hand once more. We both are, sweetheart. We both are. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, remembering that cutting phrase. The help. That's what she'd called me. But now, it wasn't an insult, it was the entire mission. Help is what we give each other. Help is how companies grow and cultures change, and people become better than they were. I had spent 12 years helping build something meaningful with my hands and my mind. Now, I was helping guide it back toward its core purpose. And I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot.